I was essentially spiritually bankrupt. As I used a knowledge of a God, and I used a spiritual knowledge and church participation to give my brain a pass that I was covering that checkbox, but I wasn't actually dealing with anything that was really broken in me.
The 100 Proof Living Podcast.
This idea of a conversation between a criminal and a cop is really just a conversation between two guys.
With Chris Pridmore and Brian Yates.
It's going to start with you being honest with yourself. Look at who you're hurting through any activity you're having. It's usually an indicator, and it would have been an indicator for me.
Well, welcome back to Conversations with a Cop and a Criminal. I'm Brian.
I'm Chris.
And today we're welcoming our first guest. I'm pretty excited to get this kicked off. We spent the last few conversations just trying to break down some of the kind of fundamental ideas that go into our conversations and what we're trying to share with people. But today it's a real privilege. Today we have a pioneer in MMA who is a former world champion, been inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, has, coached, I think, the most storied gym in all of MMA. He's an entrepreneur. He, owns, operates a podcast, a couple of them actually. And so I'm just excited to get him in here and to have him be a part of this. But today we're talking to Pat Miletich. Pat, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Brian. Thank you, buddy.
Absolutely. So, just want to just jump right in with this, and I almost want to get out of the way. I want to let you guys contribute on this and try to make some observations along the way. But Pat, we've been talking a lot about addiction and the impact on people that struggle with addiction, on the people around them. Can you share with us just a little bit on how addiction has impacted your life?
Wow, I come from literally a long line of alcoholism. Again, as I mentioned before we came on, I'm Croatian, and I have yet to meet. Well, now my brother, my sister, they're recovering alcoholics. They haven't drank. I think my sister 10 years sober, my brother 25 years sober. But Croatians are notorious for being heavy drinkers and hellraisers, and so that was just something that every family reunion, everyone was drinking, and Croatians are wired a little bit differently than I think the rest of the planet. Yeah. And but it really took kind of a bad turn as far as addiction went. When very few people know this, is that my two oldest brothers, who are deceased now, both of them committed suicide. They were molested as kids by a Catholic priest, a couple Catholic priests, and they never really got rid of their demons, and they lived on the edge the rest of their lives. I mean, they were just a bit larger than life, and I think it was to cover up their demons and bury their demons, to be honest with you. I mean, one was a multimillionaire by the time he was 23, legally. He did it all legally. And the other one was University of Iowa grad, Air Force pilot, was a VP at a corporation in Minneapolis. And after my oldest brother committed suicide, the next brother kind of went off the deep end, and because they were real close because of that experience of what they dealt with. And I think it just it kind of spiraled from there. And my brother John, who's still living, was dealing with it, and my sister, and I was so much younger than everybody that I just watched the wreckage happen. You know what I mean? I think my dad blamed himself for all of it and smoked and drank himself to death. And my mother, of course, drank for many years, and then she was sober for, probably 25, 30 years, was a nurse and a counselor at a drug and rehab place, Country Oaks, and did a lot of stuff in terms of giving back to the community. But I've seen numerous friends die from alcoholism and drug addiction and things like that. It's, people that you never expected, professional athletes who get their lives destroyed by Oxycontins, by alcohol. It's just, it runs rampant, and, it certainly doesn't pick on poor or rich or black or white. It just happens, and people that are look for that outlet instead of asking for help and going to the right people with the knowledge on how to combat it.
Right. You made a comment there that struck home with me, and my addiction is that hiding atmosphere. We talk. People think I hear a lot of people critical of people with addiction. They say, you're weak or whatever, and a lot of times it's not about the high; it's about what you're hiding from. And that was one of the things I've noticed. I know it certainly was the case with mine. And then the other part was that fear, underlying fear. It's the alcohol seems to be the way that you can actually do something easy to deal with that pain.
Yeah, no, and I fell into the alcoholism from, part of it, a big part of it was actually because I knew I saw so many people get destroyed by Oxycontins and stuff like that from pain, that I knew that I never wanted to start eating that stuff. But I can't even count how many pretty severe injuries I've had, a lot of spinal injuries, joint injuries, things like that. So I was always banged up, but it got worse and worse as I got older. So I started drinking kind of to relieve the pain to a certain extent and help myself sleep.
Right.
I had a real severe spinal injury that my whole left side of my body atrophied and all the muscles disappeared and all kinds of other stuff. And it's just excuses ultimately, now that I'm at this point in life, it just became an excuse, but it got to a point where, it almost ruined my marriage. My daughters, amazing kids, I did my best to hide it from them, but they started noticing. And that's not something you want your kids to remember you for. And it's there's just and you're right about the fear thing. Mm-hmm. Just anything. It could be financial fear. It could be the future. It could be the thing with drug addiction, many times it happens a lot because people have resentments that they can't let go of. And, my anger for the Catholic Church, trust me.
Oh, I can't imagine.
That was enough to drink an ocean full of booze.
Right. You said you don't want to be remembered for that. And that was a key turning point for me and my children, other than multiple arrests. But, at what point did you say, so you said you'd use the word almost lost your marriage, and then you talked about not wanting to be remembered for that. Brian and I talk a lot about those turning points, those prevention notices to your head to say stop. How did you find the strength to turn that corner?
Well, here's the thing with me. I'm stubborn. I'm so stubborn to the point where, I would drink, and this is just being flat out honest. I don't hide that I was a drunk at all. And I was a drunk for quite a while. I didn't drink every day or anything like that, but when I drank, buddy, I drank. And, there were times I drank a pint of Jägermeister and a bottle of wine the night before I did a 50-mile run in 97-degree heat. Jeez. Now, I finished the 50-mile run. I can't say it was a very pleasant experience, but I finished it. And I think that's probably the closest I've ever been to death. I was so dehydrated. I couldn't eat anything because I'm, and I hate saying this because I used to make fun of people, but I'm actually gluten intolerant. If I eat anything with wheat or soy in it, I get arthritis and asthma to the point where I literally can't breathe. So I ate, I think, a couple little things of hash browns at a Casey's that we stopped at along the run. And then I didn't take in enough salt, obviously, and I just drank water. So all of my electrolytes and everything were drained out of me. So there was not a whole lot of life left in me when I finished the 50 miles. But that kind of illustrates how stubborn I was and how tough I think I was and how indestructible I thought I was. And what made me quit was I had been on the East Coast. I was a couple weeks in a row, 2 or 3 weeks in a row, doing broadcasts. And I was training special forces guys out there on the East Coast, different groups, military groups. And I was running on zero sleep for I don't know how many weeks. And generally my life doesn't have a whole lot of sleep anyway when I'm on the road. And you know how that is, Brian. But I got done with that 3-week stint, got back, went to a Mexican restaurant. My wife and kids were in Montreal. My wife's from Montreal originally. And I said, I'm going to go out and grab something to eat, get back. And so I was eating, and there was a bunch of military guys and law enforcement officers from different parts of the country who were in town for whatever reason for a training. And a bunch of them recognized me. They started buying me shots. And I did some shots. And then they said, hey, we're going across the street. You got to come over there with us. We're not letting you leave. And, I could have said, all right, I'm not going to drink, whatever. But I went over and drank some more. And I drank to the point that I was drunk. and I was exhausted, and I fell asleep, and I hit a tree, an oak tree, with a beautiful diesel Ford Excursion, and wrapped that truck around that tree, and should have been dead. I mean, when the cops got there, I was standing. I somehow had gotten out of the truck. It was folded up like a tin can. But the cops got there, and my face had lacerations in it, and I was pretty banged up. And they got there and said, "Is there anybody else in the truck?" And I said, "No, I'm alone." And they said, "How are you alive?" They couldn't believe that I was alive. And it's one of those moments where you go, you know what, I could have killed somebody. I could have. And it wasn't my concern really so much for myself, but at that point you got to realize the impact that you're having on other people's lives. Now I've got, I get a drunk driving for it. It affects my wife. It affects my children. And I could have, thank God it was a tree and not a vehicle with 5 people in it, because they would have been dead.
Right.
So that was the moment that I woke up the next day. I had stitches all over in my face. I couldn't walk. My knee had a massive gash in it. My kneecap was cracked in half, and my left elbow was jacked up. I was pretty banged up, and I went to an AA meeting. My eyes were swollen shut almost, and I walked into that AA meeting, and everybody looked at me. I love that group too. It's a great AA meeting, and I mean, like, holy God, look at this guy. And I sat there and said, I want this burned into my brain. I want this moment to stay with me forever. So that's how it happened.
Well, it's funny because we've talked about that before, and we've described it as a vivid reality. Like you said, you want that memory burned into your brain, and that's what we talk about is having that vivid reality so that people can have a benchmark and look back to. And we've talked about kind of how 9/11 was a vivid reality for people, and for security concerns. And now we're far removed from 9/11. And for some people, you talk about what we would call a ground zero type incident where, you were now committed to taking the right turn and to kind of going a different direction from that. One of the questions that I always want to ask, because our goal hopefully is to swim upstream and to find the guy before he gets into that truck, to help people. So what I would ask is, looking back on that, you say, it really impacted your marriage, but that was over time. That just wasn't one night. And then you talk about how the legacy that you want to leave for your children and the way you want them to look at you, and, over time that eroded. Could you take a snapshot and look back? Were there red flags that you can identify in your life that you suspect are going on right now in other people's lives that you would point to and say, trust me, I've been on the other side of this. The next thing is you're going to get in an accident, or you're going to end up in jail, or you're going to be dead. Here are the same red flags that you share that I had.
I would say, a lot of people, it's the people that depend, that rely on themselves to solve their problems. That's a good one. I carried the world on my shoulders, and I'm sure that's common for everybody who all the guilt, all the shame for anything that's ever gone wrong, you allow it to eat at you. You, like I said, resentments, negative thoughts that, alcoholics and drug addicts are notorious for. Somebody makes them mad at 7 a.m. and they can't sleep that night, later that day, because they're still mad about. And I could never figure out how people could let go of being wronged. There were certain triggers for me that I would be angry about, and it would eat at me, and I would let those thoughts, snowball into bigger and bigger things that they were not. And that's something that I think is a signal that people. So it really comes down to, there's so much to it, Brian. And I wish I could take all the life lessons that I've had up until now and throw them in everybody's brain that needs it, and have them recognize it. But a lot of times, it comes down to having to hit their own rock bottom, and that oak tree represented my rock bottom. And there was nothing going to stop me until that oak tree, happened, to be honest with you. I could carry the world on my shoulders. I was tough. I was, I could do whatever I wanted. I was invincible. I wasn't going to do anything wrong from drinking. I could drink and go run 50 miles, and I could do whatever the hell I want, and it's just moronic. But it's the people that just can't flush the anger, and I had to turn to my creator. I had to give it all to him and just say, this is the only way it's going to happen.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that, and I would say I just think, especially coming from you, and so this is where I love this idea of talking about, we can talk a little bit about the combat sports and where you see some real pitfalls there for athletes and stuff. But you as a coach, I've worked out with you a few times, and you just have this ability, and the success of your fighter team, the combat team that has done all the Hall of Famers and past champions. But then I break it down even to the people I was in basic jiu-jitsu class with you, and the basic kickboxing stuff, and your ability to communicate and to impact people. You walk into a room with so much credibility, and that's why I would say, for our hope in this episode is that that people would actually hear you in their ear as their coach. They may have never met you, but they respect the path that you've taken. They can admire now that you have altered a course that could have been much worse than an oak tree. And so I think it means a lot, and I think you're right. I mean, Chris has said, and other people that have shared their story with us have said that I don't know that I could have observed any of the red flags sooner. It did take that kind of rock bottom incident. However, I do think as these stories mount, there are people out there searching. They know instinctively that something is broken, and maybe if we can prevent one oak tree, I would consider that a success.
I would agree with what Brian's saying on that. Your story is a lot like mine, and we talk about these rock bottoms and trying to get people to avoid them. I don't know if you've had the same situation, because you talked about your creator, something beyond you, something more powerful. The name of this show is 100 Proof Living, because it took something more than our 80 proof bottle to get us where we were at in the first place to make it. For me in my recovery, it took a number of people outside of me and learning to rely on them. You talked about how you got there and how we get there. We have this larger than life mentality that not only are all the world's problems solved by us, but all the world's blame is on us when we're in these drunken states. And your crash, my accident that ended my story. My rock bottom was also similar. It's that situation where it can't be you. I think that where the fix is in this red flag is if enough of us are out there telling the same story, that in and of ourselves we can create a massive problem, and in and of ourselves we can't get out of it. It just doesn't work that way. You need something bigger than you. For me, it's God. We also need the support system of those around us that can help guide us when we're lost. It's that humility that helps us get us back on track. And enough of us are saying if we'd known that before, that's where prevention can come out, because the volume, I would think, would start resonating.
Yeah, no, and if we could solve the problem, that's the thing, alcoholics and addicts, and it's unfortunate that you got a lot of people out there who say drug addiction and alcoholism are not diseases, and if you wouldn't have started drinking or you wouldn't have started drugging, it would have never happened, and that's on you, which is true. I have no problem accepting that responsibility, but they don't understand how the alcoholic mind works. They don't understand how you see a lot of people who are some of the kindest people you could ever meet, but they abuse themselves behind closed doors,
Agreed.
Just without mercy. Agreed. And that's the unfortunate thing, where people have to learn to love themselves first. And definitely, we depended on ourselves for so many years. That's how we ended up getting into that hole to begin with. And so, it doesn't matter for people what the greater or higher power is. That's the thing that people understand. For those people out there that are an atheist who might be struggling with addiction, listen, God doesn't have to be what everybody else calls it, Catholicism or Islam or Buddhism or anything like that. It can be just the people in AA or whatever, the group. It can be anything that you deem it, but you got to find strength in something else and rely on something else, or it's really probably not going to solve itself. And, for me, like I said, it took going to meetings, actually doing the 12 steps, paying attention to it. My sponsor, and thank God I've got a great friend who's a recovering alcoholic, who, it's kind of neat. I helped him many, many, many years ago when I was coaching and running my gym. he asked to stay at my house for a month, I think it was, or so, and he was struggling with alcoholism and got kicked out of his house or whatever, and was homeless. And so I took him in, and I said, if you promise to go to the gym with me every day, you train, you don't drink when you're here, all that sort of stuff. And I was super focused back then. I was on a mission, to be a world champion and do my thing. So, I truly had a big purpose in my mind to stay. It gave me a good reason to stay sober. And so he agreed. He did that. But he was the guy that, my wife called, who came over to the house, and had a long talk with me and said, I got a guy that you should probably talk to. And he hooked me up with a guy who was, he knew that I was so stubborn that I wouldn't listen to anybody. Only a few people out there that I would respect enough to listen to. So he hooked me up with a recovering alcoholic who was a former SEAL Team 6 member. And that guy, I tell you what, he would make me read out of it. He makes me read out of, the book. And he'll break down each paragraph. He'll ask me what I think. How do I decipher it? And he said, I'm not doing this for your benefit only. He said, I'm doing this so that you can do the same thing for somebody else.
Yeah,
that's the key. But he's an amazing guy. You can tell he was a hard driver, man. You can tell just by how he operates. But I find these guys like my running coach David Clark, who was an alcoholic drug addict for many, many years and was 340 pounds. And now he was one of the world's greatest ultra runners. He's done over 100-mile runs through the mountains, Death Valley, all that stuff. He's 160 pounds now.
Wow.
And a machine. But these guys somehow have found peace. And I wanted that, and once you figure out and you can peek in that doorway of that peace that those guys have found, it's pretty amazing.
But would you say though, Pat, that, because here's what I hear. I hear the people in this circle that you are kind of willing to be accountable to, or at least allow them to speak into your life. You got an ultra runner, you got a SEAL Team 6 guy. I mean, you deal in your circles of combat, but then also in all of the LEO training that you do. You're talking about a whole bunch of guys that are AAA personalities. I guess my question is, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would someone that, barely graduated underwater basket weaving, would they have been able to speak into your life the same way that these other guys did?
I think you have to have some sort of common ground. You know what I mean? For a woman who's a housewife who, became an alcoholic and is recovering, I think it's important that they find someone with common ground. I think it's, whoever it is, find somebody who maybe has that mentality and dealt with the same stuff that has ate at them for years or whatever it is, and caused them to do things, to end up where they were. So, like I said, for me, it had to be somebody who I knew had done some pretty crazy stuff and had survived, and those all those years of whatever they had dealt with had built up, and but that's the thing is, at the same time, almost every alcoholic and addict's story is almost the same. You know what I mean? Or certainly there's a lot of common ground or common stories in there of people that had the same mentality that led them down that road, right?
It amazed me what your story was, because I'm sitting there saying you could overlay certain elements of it, obviously with your professional career being so much different than mine. But my first day in rehab, I was all beat up. I mean, I still had all these marks on my leg, was all swollen up from shattering the steering column of my shin and everything else.
Right.
But Brian, the other part you said that really resonated with me, and Brian and I do a lot of work outside of here. That's actually how we met, was through this Disciple Maker program in our church. And he's actually the one that's supposed to teach me how to behave as a human being. And so he's said to me before, and I think on this podcast, one of the things that we've recorded is that I almost have to assess the credibility of somebody. I'm a hard-headed Scotsman. I don't necessarily let everybody in. And I also don't let whiners anywhere near my circle. If you're whining about something, I'm not really saying, I don't put credibility on that whining. I feel like I need somebody that's shown excellence, that is going to be tough love a little bit on me to a point, but also respect my opinion in a way, at least hear me out. And I felt like what you were talking about is that recovery does come from allowing yourself to let other people in. You do have to let, none of our stories, nobody that I've talked to that I find hope in has done it on their own, even though they're being the most selfish they've ever been to get better. Because if we're not better, the people around us will continue to suffer. We still need these beacons throughout it. Brian happens to have been one of my beacons. He's shown me a life that I respect and would like to be there. I don't want to be exactly like him because he's quirky, but
I don't think there's a person out there that wants to be exactly like me.
No, but it is interesting to me to hear your story, because personally, I mean, I feel like Beavis and Butthead a little bit here. I respect you a lot. You're kind of like a hero in a sport that I love. But hearing you as a man, it's very motivating to me to hear somebody that I've seen do all these things. I mean, I was an amateur fighter and a terrible one at that. To see you to do what you've done, I know the excellence that goes there, and it kind of leads into my next question a little bit about this whole thing is, I know addiction is rampant in the amateur ranks as well as in the pros. You go to an amateur fight and you can smell weed all the way through the back when people are getting ready for their fights. The teams are all out smoking weed, drinking, carrying on, while their families are out cage side cheering on little Johnny. In the pros, you see alcohol everywhere. How is it that you take these high-level names, and I don't know if I'm allowed to mention names, but, take Connor and John and TJ and all these guys that get to this, they had to have had excellence in their system. They had to have trained hard to get that level, but yet once they get there, they can't keep it together. What happens that can be how could they prevent that disaster or people in that way?
I think, it's kind of interesting to me that people implode during their career. If you think about the commonalities between a fighter and somebody in the military or law enforcement, unfortunately, law enforcement has to deal with it every day for year after year after year. And that grind down that happens on them where, alcoholism and suicide and stuff has done a number on law enforcement, unfortunately, because of the things that they've had to deal with in society. But there's more commonality as far as military veterans and retired fighters, I think, because that adrenaline rush, that camaraderie, all that stuff is gone all of a sudden. And something that I sat there and told fighters for years, all my fighters, fighting is what we do, it's not who we are.
Right.
But I didn't recognize that when I retired from even coaching, not just fighting, that there's a massive hole there. There's a huge hole, and I am absolutely addicted to adrenaline. I mean, I jumped out of an airplane out east with special forces guys out there, and it was terrifying. I'm mortified of heights. You have no idea how afraid of heights I am. But I did it because, when Navy SEALs look at you and they say, we're jumping on the planes tomorrow and you're going, you don't say no, right? But so I did it with them. But the thing that I found after I got to the ground was I can definitely do that. I want to do that a lot because that's a replacement. But at the same time, there's a role, and I'm sorry to go off on tangents, but for military, their demons are created in combat. The things that they see, and which are horrible things that I've never experienced, and then they come back. There's the loss of the camaraderie is gone, the intensity, the adrenaline, and then throw on top of that the horrible things that they witnessed. And it beats them up. Where for me, the demons were from when I was a kid and things like that, and the rough childhood, and I was taming the demons while I was fighting. I had a leash on them while I was fighting. Mm-hmm. And then when that was all gone, demons serve an amazing purpose for making you a great fighter.
Right.
Everybody that walks in that cage with you represents every demon you've ever had. And when that's all gone, then those demons are still there and they don't serve a purpose. So that, that David Clark, who's my good buddy, who's the ultra runner, said, brother, he goes, you don't have to hold on to the demons. That's the thing. Right. It's a choice, and it is a choice to hold on to those demons. And so a great book that you guys should look at, and everybody should read this book, is called The Internal Matrix. And I forget the author's name offhand, but he talks about, the epigenetics of even when you're in your mother's womb, the negativity, the hardship, the stress levels, cortisol levels, all that sort of stuff that the mother endures, the baby actually picks up those vibrations and those chemicals. And everything has a vibration around us. That desk that you're sitting in front of has a vibration. Our bodies have a vibration. And so it's important to understand the epigenetics of what happens to people, not only just in the mother's womb, but during childhood. Any things that impact and imprint on that child's mind can carry over for a lifetime. And he goes into not the conscious, the subconscious, the three layers of the mind. And there's actually drills in there that I've put in my life that work. And I recognize when negative thoughts start creeping in, and I'm able to shut them down and erase them and get rid of them. And that's those being able to practice that and get better at it is really, I can't tell you how important that is for just moving on in life from any negative things that have happened to you before.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that, Pat, because I think, for a lot of people, and this affects areas of our lives outside of addiction, but certainly in addiction, I think people a lot of times struggle with those voices, and it's this idea that you can acknowledge those voices. They don't have to drive you, and you can engage them. You can speak truth over those voices in your life. And you can kind of reframe that. So as we kind of start to wrap up this week, what, as a coach, as a boss, you've managed a lot of people in different businesses, and, even as a parent, having been through this, what are some of the observations that when you can look at someone and you can just by their demeanor or by some of the habits that you're starting to see, maybe it's the anger side or the unbridled side of anger, but what are some observations where you would say that person's really headed for trouble from an addiction standpoint?
To be honest with you, it really comes down to somebody who dwells on negativity, somebody who talks negatively quite a bit. But that's not always something that'll give it away. I mean, there are people out there that you think are the happiest people in the world, but they're like I say, behind closed doors, they're miserable. So there's people out there that hide it so well. I mean, think about it. Comedians, look at Robin Williams. Right. Comedians are some of the most depressed people in the world. People, I mean, I'll always be a jokester. I was always the class clown, but the people that love to make others laugh, many times are the most depressed people. So it's hard to recognize sometimes. I would say, what I just try to do now is just try to remind people that you gotta love yourself, man. You gotta learn to care about yourself, and that's really what it comes down to. I mean, like I say, it's just sometimes it's hard to recognize. I mean, I made a choice toward the beginning of my career, Brian, when I made a decision sitting in the basement of a house that I grew up in because I had to leave college and take care of my mother. She had a heart attack and had to leave work. She was going to lose her house and her cars, and I was working 3 jobs and I was miserable. And I sat in the basement of that house, and it flooded every time it rained. And I woke up in the morning, I put my feet down in 3 inches of water, and I was mad at the world that I couldn't finish school because of this. And I wasn't mad at my mom at all. I was just mad at the circumstances. And I took a 9mm. I was training. I won a U.S. Muay Thai kickboxing championship, and the UFC had just started. And I loaded a 9mm and I put it in the sock drawer of my dresser. And I said, I'm going to win a world title or that gun's going in my mouth. And that thing stayed there until I won a world title. And when I went home and unloaded that thing, well, I can tell you that it was a pretty emotional experience. So, I had to take myself to that level of extreme to find greatness, my level of greatness anyway, for that time in my life. I don't advise anybody to do that, but you've got to find something that's going to motivate you. You got to find passion, something that's going to really affect your life, because there's so many people out there that just feel like they're just living. They're just going through the motions. And, you guys right now, just this show, this is built off passion, and there's real purpose to this to help other people. And that's what everybody should be doing. And a good friend of mine who survived, he got hepatitis, the deadly form of hepatitis. Is that hepatitis B?
C, I think.
That's
Hepatitis C, yeah, hepatitis C. He saved a guy. He put tourniquets on a guy's leg who had tried to commit suicide and jumped in front of a train. The guy got his legs cut off. And my friend put tourniquets on his legs, and the guy bled all over him and gave him Hep C. Wow. He had gone to hospice. I had gone to see him a couple times, and he was on his deathbed. And suddenly, he's the most connected to God person I know in my life. He had no fear of dying, literally no fear. He's like, I've done everything I've wanted to. I've helped people. I've been a pastor, led people to Christ. And he said, I'm okay. I know where I'm going. And literally, the hepatitis C disappeared out of his blood. They couldn't find it anymore. And he's still healthy to this day. Wow. But he's the kind of guy that he talks about addiction a lot because he had some problems with alcohol in his life, and it's that connection to the higher power that keeps circling me back to knowing that that higher power, the passion for life, the passion for helping other people. And he told me the meaning of life. He said, I was on my deathbed. I was seeing people that were dead. So I knew I was close. And he said it was at that moment that it dawned on him that the key to life, the secret to life is helping other people. And that's what you guys are doing. And that's really what it comes down to is passion and helping other people.
I appreciate it, Pat. And I hope as this continues to develop, I hope at some point we can have you back on and we can, unpack some of this a little further. But I really appreciate you as a friend and and just doing the things that you do in the community. And I appreciate you coming on with us to tell your story. It's going to have an impact. I mean, people are going to hear this, and you're going to have credibility with a certain audience that neither of us ever would. And the woman who stays at home that's overcome alcoholism, they're different audiences who they can help. And I really appreciate you being willing to do this, Chris. I mean,
yeah, I just want to say thank you for coming on here. I mean, this is definitely born out of passion. My life came from a broken place and is on to better paths. Some of the stuff that you were saying, just it resonates. A thing that Brian and I have talked about all along is hope doesn't always feel good. It's never looking over your shoulder again. You were talking about this situation with the gun in the drawer that resonates strong in my mind in terms of that. I mean, you can visualize that picture, but you had hope because you were still striving for something. You were still fighting, even though today it didn't feel great. And you talk about this personal inventory you're taking and being honest with yourself, stop the lies. Those are all things that we've been talking about all along. And I really appreciate you coming in here and doing this. You've been very motivating to me personally, so thank you.
Well, thank you guys.